Okay, let's dive in. We're looking at the source material known pretty simply as sanaurelio.pdf today. But we're not doing a standard historical review here. We're treating this as a literary excavation, more like the anatomy of a modern American myth.
Exactly. We're looking at history not just as what happened, but how it was written, how it was framed. Because this document, this investigation, it's really aiming to systematically tear apart the official story.
Right. The narrative that San Aurelio was, just a bunch of armed tax dodgers and cultists who basically got what was coming to them.
After that raid 2 decades ago.
And that initial image you get when you first read about it, it's so powerful. It really sets the stage. You see the pictures of the abandoned ruins out in the Florida Everglades.
The skeletal frame of that church steeple, yeah, sticking right out of the swamp.
And then you hear those old local news clips, right? The anchor talking breathlessly about the treasure of San Aurelio.
Oh, that rumored gold stash.
The gold that supposedly just vanished. It feels less like history and more like the setup for a modern-day Western.
And that's really the mission for you, for the listener today.
Yeah.
We want to analyze how these real-life people, these deeply held beliefs, and of course, the external media narratives all collided, how they shaped San Aurelio's very short, very violent life.
So we're looking at the town less as a failed event and more as a powerful and enduring American myth.
A myth about ideological conflict. At its heart, it's individual sovereignty versus state power.
It is just fascinating how quickly the reality, it started as a pretty mundane bureaucratic fight.
Oh, absolutely. Zoning disputes.
Yeah, and how it mutated into this weaponized caricature. The story is just built on these classic literary devices, isn't it?
It really is. You've got the foundational archetype of the siege.
The flawed anti-hero founders.
And the absolute perfect example of a MacGuffin. The gold vault.
The MacGuffin is so central. It's a brilliant narrative tool, especially in the hands of the state.
Well, it's like the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, right? Or the Maltese Falcon. It's the thing everyone wants, the thing that drives the plot and justifies these extreme actions.
But in the end, its actual existence is kind of irrelevant to the real conflict.
Exactly.
So in this case, the rumor of the gold vault becomes the immediate justification for the entire federal intervention. It completely masks the ideological fight underneath.
The belief in the gold was the real catalyst, not the gold itself. It was the perfect narrative tool. It turned what was philosophical defiance into simple, understandable criminal greed.
That's it. If they're just resisting zoning laws, it's a local problem, a misdemeanor.
But if they're an armed separatist cell hoarding truckloads of bullion,
Then it's a federal emergency. It's a threat to the national economy. The framing dictated the entire response. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. The source material makes it so clear that the seat of San Aurelio wasn't some sunny utopian vision.
no, not at all. It was a reaction, a direct and often really personal reaction.
A defensive crouch, almost, against what they saw as bureaucratic failure.
And you see that most sharply in the story of Sarah Whitfield. Her character is the archetype of the independent homesteader just pushed to the brink. It wasn't just one big thing. The document calls it a death by paper cuts.
Right. It wasn't just that her greenhouse in Virginia was bulldozed. It was the arbitrary nature of it all.
State inspectors, supposedly for environmental regulations, demanding these specific expensive modifications that she argued were totally unnecessary.
She was convinced they were just shaking her down. Her quote is, she didn't grease the right palms.
The official reason was protecting a wetland area, but to Sarah, it felt like the state was just clearing the way for bigger politically connected farms.
And that was before the raw milk prosecution.
Which is just incredible. A small, private trade. She's selling to regular customers who know her, who trust her, and suddenly it's treated as a criminal enterprise.
Facing fines, even jail time for selling milk, it was that constant grinding interference that created this deep hunger for a place where her self-sufficiency wasn't seen as a threat.
And her story connects right to that big theme, doesn't it? The state frames everything as being about safety, food safety, environmental safety.
But for the people on the ground, like Sarah, it just felt like control, pure and simple.
The state just couldn't tolerate that she could feed herself and her neighbors without asking permission first.
And that feeling, that sense of oppression, it sets the stage for how this whole thing starts.
The meetings at Red Dog's Bar, or in the park. It wasn't some charismatic leader calling everyone together.
No, it was just a gathering of, disillusioned people, each one of them bringing their own personal scar to the table.
Their own specific betrayal that made this radical idea of starting a new town seem completely rational.
Let's talk about those scars. Ethan, the source, calls him the muscle. He's the disillusioned soldier, a combat vet whose faith in the whole system had just been shattered.
He had this cynical view of power. He called it bureaucracy with guns. He wasn't disillusioned with the act of fighting, but with the reasons for fighting.
He talks about missions that were really just about securing a contractor's supply chain, not about defending people.
So he wasn't looking for another war. He was looking for a place where he could, and this is his quote, actually defend what was yours.
He wanted a moral anchor for the skills the army gave him, skills he thought had been wasted serving corruption.
He was searching for integrity. And San Aurelio promised this clear boundary, a line between us and them, where defense was personal, not political.
Then you shift gears completely to Marcus Lee, the cipher.
Oh, the pure tech libertarian archetype.
Totally. Stanford, big shot in Silicon Valley, until he refused to compromise on his principles.
His betrayal was all digital, all ideological. He refused to add a recovery key, a backdoor to his encrypted messaging app.
He argued it made the whole point of encryption a lie to his users, and that got him exiled professionally.
Right, and what's so interesting and so relevant to his trial later on is this internal memo he wrote. He rejected what he called the multicolored homogeneity of corporate diversity checklists.
Arguing for real diversity of merit and creativity.
And for that, he was immediately labeled racist and misogynist by his colleagues, which, of course, the prosecution later used to frame his privacy tools as being for extremists.
So he saw this soft tyranny of conformity in the tech world.
And he fled. He wanted a physical place where he could build systems based on pure trust and mathematics outside of anyone's control. He literally called San Aurelio the blockchain made flesh.
That is an amazing line. But wait, if Marcus is fleeing the soft tyranny of corporate culture, how does he find common cause with someone like Gabo Martinez, the voice?
Yeah, Gabo carried the scars of actual hard tyranny.
Absolutely. A Cuban exile who watched his own parents die while they were waiting for U.S. visas because Cuba's state-run hospitals were collapsing.
For him, government control wasn't some abstract theory. It was the thing that actively denies you faith, food, or dignity.
He's the moral authority of the group, really. He's not talking about economic papers. He's talking about starvation, about death.
And that's the connection. Gabo's lived experience, it made Marcus's abstract ideas about decentralized control real, tangible. His calm voice, speaking from the reality of what he'd seen socialism do, it gave weight to the whole thing. They hated the system for different reasons, but they hated the same outcome. The state having the final say on your life.
And we also have Daniel Herrera, the architect. He's carrying a different kind of scar, the scar of complicity.
Right. His family's construction company built faulty public housing.
And it was enabled by municipal corruption, greasing palms, cutting corners.
He felt this deep guilt. His family's success was built on lies enforced by a corrupt system. He needed a new foundation, literally and figuratively.
And he provides the theological scaffolding for the whole project. He blends his faith with the economics of the Austrian school. The source mentions Jesus Huerta de Soto specifically.
Yes. And for listeners who aren't familiar, Huerta de Soto is all about free markets and, crucially for Daniel, private property rights as a moral imperative.
So how did Daniel connect that to his faith?
He argued that God gave us freedom not to be ruled. He used economics to frame liberty as God's design. So any state interference with your property or with voluntary trade wasn't just inefficient, it was immoral. The state was the tempter working against God's plan.
So he gave a spiritual legitimacy to their resistance. It wasn't just about zoning laws anymore.
Exactly. It became a crusade for moral purity.
And then finally you have Jack Doyle, the Cassandra, the guy who injects the grand paranoia.
The shadowy figure. We don't even know if that's his real name. He was obsessed with the long arc of history. Fiat collapse, gold revaluations, long cycles of civilizational decline. He's citing the fall of Rome and predicting a crash around the year 2130.
He's the one bringing in all the modern conspiracy language, the World Economic Forum, WEF, C40 climate policy, Soros.
He's the necessary paranoid element in the narrative, you know. He sees these grand global patterns that connect all of their individual local pain. Sarah's greenhouse, Marcus's canceled career jack, connects it all to this global machine of control. As the investigator, Rachel, noted in the document, he had the Cassandra curse.
He was never believed until the damage was too obvious to deny.
Right. So you have this crucible of personal betrayals, a soldier, a coder, an exile, a builder, a farmer.
They didn't come together because they all loved the same idea. They came together because they all hated the same system, and that shared wound was their strongest bond. Okay, so we've established the why, the individual motivations. But how do they go from just talking in a bar to actually winning ground against the county?
Well, they didn't just ignore the system at first. They actually used its own failures against itself.
This is the paperwork war phase.
Exactly. Sarah led the legal strategy using adverse possession laws, which meant they would find abandoned property, occupy it, maintain it, and this is the key part, pay the back taxes that the legal owners or the county had let slide.
Which is so brilliant because they're proving they respect property rights more than the government supposedly enforcing them.
And it was slow, meticulous. This was a decade-long process, but it was profoundly legal.
And that's where Marcus's tech skills come in.
The perfect counterpoint.
Right.
He scraped all the county land records, which are a total mess, paper files, outdated maps.
Right.
And he built his own searchable database. It was faster and more accurate than what the county had. It allowed them to pinpoint those neglected, vulnerable parcels of land instantly.
So you have this perfect fusion. Sarah's grassroots legal strategy, what she called death by paperwork.
Combined with Marcus's hyper-efficient distributed systems.
They were fighting bureaucratic incompetence with superior information and sheer diligence, and they were winning. Quietly.
And that quiet success is what leads to the inciting incident. The moment the MacGuffin, the gold vault, is born, they're succeeding, but then the county inspectors show up again, this time for what seemed like some arbitrary unpaid property taxes.
Let's slow this down, because this is the moment everything changes. The inspectors arrive, they demand payment, and then they implicitly offer a bribe.
The source says they offered to make the tax issues disappear if the community was just a bit more flexible.
Grease the wheels.
This was the test, and the defiance was just absolute. This is Ethan's moment to shine. He doesn't just say no, he chambers around in his rifle, and he says, I say this conversation is over.
And the sound of that action, that chambered round, it just instantly transforms a boring tax dispute into a military standoff.
And what happens next is pure narrative invention. The officials couldn't just go back and say they were outsmarted by paperwork and intimidated by one guy. They needed a bigger, more sinister reason for this defiance.
So the reason is invented on the spot by the departing clerk who's shaken up, and she whispers to her boss about reserves, gold, that they must be hiding something.
And Jack, the Cassandra, sees his chance. He yells after them, go back to your boss, Soros, and starts referencing the WEF and C40.
It's perfect. He merges the local fear, the gold, with the global conspiracy theory. This simple refusal to comply immediately becomes a story about a hidden treasure hoard.
And just like that, the MacGuffin is born. Not from any internal fact, but from external fear and the need to rationalize resistance. The gold became the reason, the excuse, for everything that came after.
So let's shift from that external story to what was actually happening inside their economy, the economy of trust.
It was a conscious project, a complete rejection of fiat money.
They ran on barter, right? Trading milk, honey, eggs, mechanical work.
Barter or hard assets.
Yeah.
Specifically silver coins. Pre-1965 junk silver, which had actual intrinsic value from its silver content, separate from whatever the government said it was worth.
Galbo called it muscle currency, a system based on voluntary trade that respects the dignity he gave each of us. It was a return to money based on actual labor and tangible worth.
Yeah, and to be clear for the listener, they weren't just like hoarding silver bars. They're using it for daily transactions. Sarah might trade a gallon of milk for, say, 3 pre-65 silver dimes. The value was based on real things, not a number printed on a piece of paper.
A decentralized currency designed to resist inflation and government control.
But of course, this principled choice was immediately distorted by the outside world.
Bank tellers, UPS drivers who were still delivering to them, they started noticing the heavy boxes and the silver coins being used.
And local radio just ran with it. It became a shadow economy, truckloads of bullion.
A Fort Knox in the imagination.
That's the phrase. The simple existence of a trust-based alternative was perceived as a massive threat.
And that distortion was weaponized during the trial. Marcus's crypto philosophy and the community's use of silver became legal evidence of financial subversion.
The prosecution argued his encrypted communication proved he had something to hide, and the silver proved they were operating outside federal authority.
They twisted the desire for privacy and self-sufficiency into proof of criminal intent.
They did. Marcus's whole argument that privacy isn't a crime got flipped on its head. The prosecutor basically said, "But criminals are the biggest beneficiaries of your systems, Mr. Lee."
And the silver coins, the physical fact of them, became the ideological proof that their entire project was illegal and subversive.
Okay.
This is the part where the literary framing just completely takes over and crushes the reality of what was happening.
This is the villainization stage.
And the source shows how the appearance and faith of Gabo and Daniel were immediately used to frame San Aurelio as a cult, a sect, a brotherhood.
It was instant typecasting. Gabo's look, the long hair, the dark beard with streaks of white. It fit the media's perfect archetype of the bearded prophet.
The press needs a single sinister figurehead. It's easy to sell a story about a dangerous cult leader. It's much harder to sell a headline about decentralized governance and property rights.
And they just projected that image onto Gabo, even though the whole community was defined by voluntary cooperation, not a single leader.
Daniel's sermons were just fuel for that fire. He's blending scripture with Hayek and Huerta de Soto, talking about true liberty as God's design.
And they just took this sophisticated libertarian theology and reduced it to, fundamentalist anarchy. Daniel talks about the state as the tempter, and the media hears Jim Jones or David Koresh.
And that framing was so crucial because it allowed Washington and Tallahassee to see San Aurelio not as some local zoning dispute,
but as a dangerous precedent, a political contagion.
The federal memos detailed in the source are, they're chillingly rational from their perspective. The Treasury Department flagged the silver economy as undermining federal monetary authority.
They didn't see it as local barter. They saw it as an existential threat to the U.S. dollar.
And the DOJ focused on the threat of de facto governance outside federal structures. The fact that San Aurelio was actually working, that they had their own dispute resolution, their own economy, that was the real threat.
They were challenging the state's monopoly on governance itself.
Which, of course, turned it into a political football. You had conservative politicians in Florida using San Aurelio to rail against federal overreach,
posing as heroes of states' rights, while their opponents were seizing on the armed extremist narrative to push for law and order.
San Aurelio became a proxy war for the nation's political divides. Both sides were just using it to fundraise and score points.
And the ghost of past failures was hanging over the whole thing. The source says that internal FBI memos explicitly noted, "This isn't Waco yet."
Wow, so they were completely aware of the risk. They knew they could create martyrs.
Absolutely aware of the escalation spiral. But the decision was still made to reassert primacy. The goal wasn't just to resolve the situation. The goal was to send a message.
The message being that decentralized systems will not be allowed to stand against federal authority.
The message was more important than the cost.
And to give that move moral cover, they shifted the argument to the children.
The classic move, the refrain, "Somebody needs to think of those children," started coming out of the Department of Education. They were concerned about unregulated curricula.
It's the perfect tactic, isn't it? You transform a legal fight over property and money into a moral crusade to save kids from indoctrination.
And once you frame it that way, the use of overwhelming force is justified in the court of public opinion.
And this brings us back to Jack Doyle, the Cassandra, because all of his previously mocked theories suddenly start to seem plausible as the pressure mounts.
His rants about the World Economic Forum, the C40 climate policies, Soros, it was all fringe talk at first.
But then, as these global organizations became more visible in the news and the federal government started using these huge, coordinated methods to isolate them,
Jack's simple, jargon-free accusations started to resonate. He was stripping the jargon away, as the source puts it.
Why those specific names, though? What did they represent?
They represented everything San Aurelio was designed to resist. Jack saw groups like the WEF and C40 as these global governance bodies trying to enforce universal conformity, social, economic, even architectural conformity. And San Aurelio was the ultimate act of resistance through radical self-sufficiency.
So his theories turned the initial skepticism inside the group into doubt, then recognition. They started to believe their small local fight really was connected to these huge, shadowy forces he warned them about.
The external pressure validated their internal paranoia. Jack's curse was fulfilled. The damage was becoming too obvious to deny.
So the war of words, the rhetorical war, it quickly gives way to an actual logistical siege.
The noose tightens, and it's not with bullets at first. It's with the supply chain.
UPS and FedEx suddenly refuse to deliver. Cell service gets cut.
And crucially, their diesel generator, which power their water pumps, starts running dry because fuel deliveries are blocked.
Yeah.
They're being choked slowly.
The isolation was becoming total. And internally, Gabo gives this final warning, which really reinforces the voluntary nature of the community.
He says, choose to leave. I won't judge. He offers safe passage out. He's emphasizing that resistance is a choice, not a command.
But at the same time, the internal response shows they know it's coming. Ethan and Jack buy .50 caliber rifles.
Yeah, and they're not buying them for hunting. They're buying them as a psychological deterrent. Heavy firepower.
The idea being that the feds would know what that means.
It was a final, desperate line in the sand. An attempt to make the government hesitate.
But the whole tragedy, the final breakdown, it all hinges on the ambiguity of that first shot.
The source details the ATF patrol running into Gabo and Ethan, and then just fragmented radio traffic. Under fire, officer down.
And this is where the narrative control is just locked in instantly. Despite internal doubts, there's that handwritten note on a staff memo that just says, who is shooting?
Despite that, the public narrative was immediately cemented. This was an ambush by armed separatists.
The conclusion was set in stone the moment that first spark was lit. The institutional story just steamrolled any ambiguity on the ground.
And you see that play out instantly in the media. The headlines are this perfect, stark dichotomy.
Mothers flee militia compound on one channel.
And peaceful exodus signals hope on another. It wasn't reporting. It was just projecting pre-existing political alignment.
And that whole spectacle of conflict is then perfected during the trial. The trial becomes the ultimate tool for imposing the official story.
They used legal mechanisms to prosecute identity, not just action.
The felony murder rule is the key to that. We should probably break that down.
We really should. It's how they got convictions for everyone left standing, whether they fired a shot or not.
So, just for clarity, how did the prosecution use that rule to convict someone like Sarah, the farmer, the legal strategist, who was nowhere near the shooting?
Okay, so the felony murder rule basically says that if a death occurs while you're committing another felony, in this case, the underlying felony was conspiracy to resist federal authority.
So that was the crime they were all supposedly committing just by being there.
Exactly. So if someone dies during that conspiracy, then everyone involved in the conspiracy is legally guilty of murder, regardless of who pulled the trigger.
So they didn't have to prove Sarah shot anyone. They just had to prove she was part of the group. It was a trial of identity.
It was. Sarah, the logistical backbone, gets 25 years. She was condemned for being an active, efficient member of a community that resisted. Marcus, the dangerous ideologue wrapped in code, he got 10 years. His philosophy of privacy was framed as material support for a paramilitary group. His code was his weapon.
And Ethan, the military muscle, gets 40 years.
His own service record used against him as proof of his intent.
And the source notes that Sarah died in prison years later. Heart failure, officially. But the investigator, Rachel, suggests that maybe it was because her world had failed, not just her body.
And the dead. Gabo and Daniel, the moral core of the group, they weren't framed as victims. They were framed as co-conspirators whose deaths were the fault of their own friends. The court's ruling neutralized any chance they had of becoming martyrs.
And then there's the ghost. The ultimate narrative loose end. The ghost of Jack Doyle.
Tried in absentia. For conspiracy, murder, everything.
His absence just solidifies his legend, doesn't it? The official story gets the perfect villain, the paranoid mastermind who got away.
He's either the ultimate folk hero or the ultimate coward, depending on who you ask. And because he's never caught, he ensures the myth of San Aurelio never gets a clean ending.
It allows the state's failure to be hidden behind the ongoing search for the fugitive and the phantom gold. So when you put it all together, when you synthesize San Aurelio's story from this idealistic experiment to this devastating political symbol,
You see a pattern we've seen before in modern American history. Ruby Ridge, Waco.
the town failed physically. I mean, it was destroyed. But it succeeded as a powerful, enduring narrative.
The investigator's conclusion in the document really cuts right to the heart of it. The real treasure was never gold. It was the stubbornness of people who wanted to build something outside the reach of a system they no longer trusted.
They weren't crushed for what they did wrong. They were crushed for what they did right, for building a resilient, functioning alternative.
The real tragedy is the system's inability to tolerate the mere existence of that alternative.
That tension between the desire for self-sufficiency and the state's absolute demand for compliance, it never went away. It's still here.
And that tension is the core question that lingers. If a small community focused on building and barter and code, if they can be perceived and crushed as a paramilitary threat just for refusing to bend the knee, then what does that say about the fragility of any decentralized system, whether it's technological like Marcus's code or communal like Sarah's garden, once it reaches a certain critical mass?
The story of San Aurelio really forces you to ask, how do we even determine the line between a community and a conspiracy when the observer, the state, the media, the jury already believes the worst? And maybe more importantly, when does refusing to compromise your ideals transform you from a stubborn citizen into a dangerous criminal? That definition, that line is the treasure that can't be buried.